Good morning. Welcome to Local Foods and Hand-Cut Foods here on Chicago's North Side. I'm Jim Murphy. This is Grow TV, Grow Forward TV. We're here with Father Steve Katsouros, Dean and Executive Director of Arrupe College of Loyola University, a very exciting new project on Chicago's North Side, and also author of Come to Believe. So, Father Steve, I'd like to just ask you a couple questions about your project and welcome you to Chicago.
That's great. Thanks, Jim.
You know, let's just start and tell people a little bit about how where you grew up, how you got started. Take us up to the point in time where you decided you wanted to become a Jesuit.
Oh, wow. Okay. So I've spent most of my life in New York City, and I guess my first exposure to the Jesuits or the Society of Jesus was I did the Jesuit Volunteer Corps, or JVC. Now the preliminary, so I'm the son of a Greek diner owner, and I was the first one in my family to go to college. When I told my father that I was majoring in English, he said, "English? You speak English. Why are you majoring in English?" So 4 years later, when I told him I wanted to do the Jesuit Volunteer Corps, JVC, he said, "JVC?" He said, "You're an English major. You know nothing about stereo equipment. Why are you doing JVC?" So he was a Weisenheimer. My assignment with the Jesuit Volunteer Corps was at Covenant House in Times Square. A really extraordinary experience, and one that kind of confirmed for me my desire to accompany young people in a pretty substantive way. At Covenant House, it was a very transient population, and that was the mission of that organization. I landed at a middle school on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, before that was Disneyized, in the early 1980s, called Nativity, run by Jesuits. And that really suited my desire to really work with students year-round. So
you were a lay person at this point?
I was a lay person, had no interest in the Jesuits, but I kept coming back to Nativity for a year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. After a while, the Jesuits said, "Look, it's time. Why don't you give us a whirl here?" So I thought, all right, let me get this out of my system. I entered the society as a novice in August of 1987, so almost 30 years ago. And I thought, well, this will be like a weekend, and then I'll get on with my life. 30 years later, here I am.
That's a good story.
Yeah.
And how long is the process from the time you decided to go into it till the time you were ordained and on your way?
Yeah, so certainly during my time, now I already had college. I had undergrad in the English major, as you know from my father's story, and a master's from Fordham. And but the Jesuits are very well trained. 2 years as a novice, 2 years studying philosophy, and I did that here at Loyola University, Chicago. That was my first exposure to the Midwest, to Chicago, and I loved it. I loved Loyola, and I loved the city. It was great being here. I never knew that I would be back here to work. 3 years working. So for me, that was starting a middle school, much like Nativity. This one was located in Harlem, a middle school for African American boys. I started with another Jesuit and a layman, and that was, again, a great experience. I found out that I liked administration at that point. I went on from there to study theology, and while I was getting a degree in MDiv, a master's in divinity, I also got a master's in administration from the Harvard Graduate School of Education. That was a really extraordinary experience. I was a deacon for a year at St Ignatius Loyola Parish in New York City on Park Avenue, a great parish community. And I was ordained on June the 13th, 1998. And really the happiest day of my life was the next day, the 14th, when I was able to celebrate Mass for my family and friends at St Ignatius as a way of saying, really thank you. Thank you for carrying me in my vocation through all these years of preparation and training with the Jesuits.
So tell us a little bit about the history of St Ignatius, who he was, what he did. A lot of my viewers have no idea. We have a high school here in Chicago that does very well, St Ignatius. But I don't think a lot of people know much about him. Why don't you tell us a little bit about him?
Sure. So St. Ignatius was born to a noble family in the Basque area of Spain, not far from Bilbao. And Ignatius was the youngest son. He was a soldier and a ladies' man, had a lot of daring do, and saw himself as a soldier and someone who was going to be a player in the Spanish court. He was injured during a battle in Pamplona, and was hit by a cannonball in his leg. And that cannonball experience really changed the trajectory of his life. He was recovering in the family castle. I visited it, and it really is a castle. And during that time of recovery, he was a reader. He wanted to read a lot of romantic novels. They weren't available. Instead, what was available for his reading was a Bible and the lives of the saints. And particularly the lives of the saints really inspired him. He said, if St. Francis of Assisi or St. Dominic could do great things, perhaps I can too. Also, again, Ignatius was very romantic. He always saw himself as wooing a great woman, a queen, and he transferred a lot of that towards a great affection for Mary, the mother of Jesus. So he came out of this recovery period sort of a different man, and went away to an area outside of Barcelona and prayed and prayed and prayed, and came up with a handbook of prayer that has helped thousands, if not millions, of people since, called the Spiritual Exercises. So students and retreatants and people around the world have benefited from this handbook of prayer. What makes Ignatius so accessible and so important to the 21st century is that his style of prayer meets people where they are at. He doesn't make God something that's up in the sky or far away or not part of our real lives. Ignatius used to talk about how we can find God in all things, in each other, in our relationships, in nature, in the joys of our lives, and also in the setbacks and sufferings of our lives, that God is everywhere. Ignatius was very committed to education, and he was sort of an all or nothing kind of guy. So he wanted to get the best education he could because he said the people of God deserved the best. He went to the University of Paris, which was the most elite university on the planet at that time. And he befriended a number of other younger men, including a fellow named Francis Xavier. And he was very charismatic, very persuasive, Ignatius was. And together with Francis Xavier and these other students, he formed the Society of Jesus. Ignatius became the great administrator for the Jesuits. And again, very thoughtful. He would encourage the Jesuits to practice discernment. And again, that's what makes him so relevant and so modern. Think about, reflect on where God is in your life. When you're making a decision, how do you make decisions? Do you have a moral compass? What gives you what he called consolation? What gives you desolation? He would encourage Jesuits to do a daily examination of conscience, where you sort of discern, all right, where was God yesterday? In my case, in our students, in meetings, in an interaction, here in Chicago. Where did I fall short in terms of being the person that God is inviting me to be? But anyway, Ignatius as administrator. So one of the things that...
Let me just ask you one quick question about Paris. So they opened the first Jesuit church in Paris, is that correct?
They didn't. No, Ignatius landed in Rome, and he studied in Paris, but really he got the approval from the Pope in 1540 to start this new Society of Jesus. Even that was very controversial, that title. Usually they were called Franciscans after St. Francis or Dominicans after St. Dominic. Jesus was pretty, perceived as arrogant, which is part of the Jesuit charism, I guess. But, the idea of the Society of Jesus was really, we want to be companions with, we consider ourselves in close company with Jesus. He is the central person, central relationship in our lives. The Jesuits at that point were getting a reputation for being extraordinary teachers because they had this great training. And other people wanted to benefit from this teaching. Now, I love this. Ignatius was being encouraged to open schools for lay people, laymen at that time. And he said, no way, we're not starting schools. It's a terrible idea. I don't want to be bogged down with a college or a school or a university. Now, you know, if that were the case, I'd be unemployed right now if Ignatius had not changed his mind. Basically, Ignatius realized after a while that schools were an important vehicle to impact people. Ignatius used to say that Jesuits, we should be influencing those who will influence others. And schools and education were a great way of influencing leaders in Rome. The first school was opened actually in Sicily, in Messina, in the late 1540s. And it's become the most successful and far-reaching educational network in the world. For example, there are 200 Jesuit colleges and universities around the world today. 28 of them are in the United States.
That's unbelievable.
Yeah.
That's really something.
Yeah.
And even in Asia and
Yeah.
all around the world.
Well, he sent his friend Francis Xavier first to India. He was wildly successful there. Well, first to Japan. He was very successful there. And that was also the genius of Ignatius. So, you know, it wasn't like, oh, we're bringing God to Japan. Rather, Francis Xavier learned Japanese. He dressed as the Japanese did. He ate Japanese cuisine. And the message was, we really honor who you are and what your culture is and what your values are and what your traditions are. So Ignatius used to say, if you go in through their door, they'll come out through our door.
Right.
But it's really an exchange. One of his other missionaries, Matteo Ricci, was wildly successful, the same kind of plan in China. And this has always been our strategy. We call it now Inculturation, where we go deep in the culture wherever we are assigned and find value there and learn from the people we're serving. It's not this top-down, we have all the answers and you're this empty vessel and we're going to, you know, enlighten you, but rather, let's learn from each other.
Why do you think it is that it's been so many years, the Society of Jesus has been around and there hasn't been a pope that's been a Jesuit up until now? Why do you think that is?
Well, you know, again, I'm not good at calling trends. And, you know, right before Cardinal Bergoglio's election as Pope Francis, I said, oh, there will never in my lifetime, never ever be a Jesuit Pope. Never say never, right? I think that, who knows, you know, a lot of times people have said that the Jesuits are perceived as being so influential that not being elevated to the papacy was a way of keeping us in check. It's that Jesuit arrogance thing again, I guess.
So you've written a book.
Yes.
Come to Believe. It's about some of your efforts here in Chicago, and an amazing project that I find to be personally one of the most interesting education initiatives we've seen in Chicago in a long time. Tell us about. Let's start by talking about the book. What inspired? Why a book?
Yeah. I have to say, writing a book while being engaged in a startup, what was I thinking? So Orbis, a venerable Catholic publishing house back east, reached out to me in August of 2015, just as we were enrolling our first class of students. So it was a mad dash to get things off the ground. And then here is this, you know, great guy. I've known him from previous chapters of my life, saying, hey, Steve, how about writing a book about the startup of Arrupe College? And I said, you know, I don't have time to brush my teeth now, much less write a book. But I thought about it, and I thought, well, it's an important story. You know, I frequently say, and I mean this with all sincerity, I have the best gig in higher ed right now. You know, this opportunity to make a Jesuit, Catholic, private, liberal arts education available and accessible and affordable for underrepresented young women and men here in Chicago. So it's an important story to record.
It tells the story of your startup.
Yes.
It tells the story of your first year.
Correct.
You're just completing your second year.
Yeah.
So this is your first graduating class.
That's right.
Wow. So tell us about that.
Yeah, so we're a two-year college. Our students get associate's degrees. It's the first time that Loyola University has offered an associate's degree program. It's the first time that any of the 28 colleges and universities started by the Jesuits in the U.S. Have initiated something like this. So this is a really big deal for Jesuit and Catholic education. And our first graduation is on Saturday, August the 12th. Our students go to school year-round, so they take 4 classes in the fall semester, 4 in the spring, 2 in the summer. But we know that this is going to be an extraordinary day for our students, for ourselves, for Loyola University, for Jesuit education, I think for the city of Chicago. Getting here has been quite a journey. I'm very grateful to our students who, I always say, have co-pioneered this with us. They're the pioneers. They took a great risk enrolling in this startup. Loyola University has a very strong brand identity here in Chicago, and rightfully so.
Why Loyola University versus one of the other 28 Jesuit schools?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. You know, I think that there is a spirit of innovation here in Chicago. You know, the first Cristo Rey High School opened here 20 years ago. Now there are over 30 of those. Yeah, that's in Pilsen. That was a big experiment, and it's been a wildly successful one. So if your viewers don't know, that's a high school started by Jesuits and lay people, and the way that they make a Jesuit high school education affordable to this, group is that the students work 1 day a week to offset their tuition expenses. So now, as I said, there are over 30 of these around the country. So there's already a tradition for how let's rethink how we can deliver Jesuit education here in Chicago. Father Mike Garanzini, the former president of Loyola University, this was really his vision, and Mike had been president here for 14 years before he stepped down. Now he's the university's chancellor. But in conversations with administrators in Chicago's public high schools, charter high schools, and Catholic high schools, he would say, what happens to your graduates who are not 4.0, 3.9 GPAs with ACTs of 30 or higher, and who are from low-income backgrounds? Not much happens for them.
No.
They languish in city colleges, and for some students they can be very successful in city colleges, but in others they get lost in the shuffle. They rack up a lot of debt. They may go into the military, and that's certainly admirable and honorable, but we all like options. And Loyola University and Jesuit higher ed was just not an option for these young people.
So it can cost for a student to go to Loyola University and live there in a dorm, it can cost $55,000, $60,000 a year.
That is correct.
And that's pretty much across Jesuit universities.
Yes.
That's more the norm. That's the norm.
Yeah.
That could be right upper middle.
Right.
What does it cost one of your families to come to Arrupe College for a year?
Yeah. So our total cost is $15,804 per student. Okay. All of our students commute. So that's a big cost savings. Also, we benefit from being in a building on Pearson and State, less than a block away from Chicago and State. So it's great for commuters. But it's $15,800. Now, our students, unless they're undocumented, our students are qualified. They're eligible for federal and state aid. That immediately shaves off $10,000 from that $15,804. We bill our students a little over $1,200 a year, all right? And then the rest we fundraise.
That's your job.
Correct, right. So, all you viewers out there, ARRUPE.
So $1,200 a year gets your graduates into a position that they would be possibly eligible to graduate from a 4-year school with 2 more years.
That's right.
Or 2.5, maybe.
That's right, yeah.
So you've got this first graduating class of how many?
Yeah, so we are looking to graduate 109 on August the 12th. 109 will walk. So, yeah.
And how many do you think are going to go to four-year college in your first year?
I'd say, you know, it's funny. The transfer thing is different from fresh out of high school. Also, we're finding that the May 1 cutoff, this was just an article in the New York Times recently, it's more June 1. So there's still, you know, we're doing this interview at the end of June. It's still a little bit of a lot of horse trading going on here in terms of cobbling together tuitions and that kind of a thing. Many of the Jesuit higher ed institutions around the country have been very generous. They're very supportive. They're watching what we're doing. So I said, well, stop watching and start taking our graduates. And they are. They're responding.
Good.
And over 20 of our students are continuing on, at least over 20, are continuing on at Loyola University, including living on campus, which is a huge investment by Loyola University.
Wonderful.
Other students of ours are going to the University of Wisconsin in Madison, UW in Milwaukee. They're going to Arrupe College in Wisconsin, UIC here, Dominican, DePaul. So that's the lineup.
Fantastic, fantastic. What do you think? What's the one thing you've come to learn working with the Chicago community in terms of fundraising, in terms of trying to tell your story around town and what you're trying to do? What resonates with you?
Yeah. So a big thing when I start talking about Arrupe College. Immediately people say, God, what a great idea. You know, no matter what your political stripe is, I think people are saying, this is so needed. It's so great that this is happening. Why wasn't this thought of before? How can we replicate this in other universities, in other locations, locally, statewide, and nationally? And then, you know, for Arrupe, when you talk, we give all of our students the opportunity to be involved in summer orientation, which includes being a part of a retreat at Loyola University's Retreat and Ecology Center out in Woodstock, Illinois.
All right.
Well, everyone gets how important orientation is. And this doesn't require a whole lot of research to know that if you have a good orientation where you meet your advisor, you register for classes, you meet your classmates, you know where you're going, you know how long your commute's going to be, the retention rates go up. The sense of belonging increases. That's what we want for these students. So people say, all right, Father, how much is that orientation per student? Okay, $660. All right, great, I'll pay for X amount of kids to do orientation. We give all of our freshmen laptops so that they're all on the same page. It's not like, oh, well, you're doing your homework on your smartphone and I'm doing mine on a tablet and she's doing hers on a desktop and he doesn't have anything, to work off. We're all working with the same machine. So again, that's an opportunity. For the transfer for four-year students, we take the students on college tours. So they're looking at schools in Indiana and St. Louis and around Illinois and up to Wisconsin. So people want to support that. That makes sense to a lot of our folks. We provide a breakfast and lunch program every day. All of our students are affected by gun and gang violence here in Chicago, and many are affected by food and housing insecurities. So we provide a phenomenal, nutritious, delicious breakfast and lunch that, for a lot of our students, these are real incentives to come to school because they're not getting that at home.
Plus they learn a little bit about what to eat and not to eat.
That's right, and also
a new way of thinking about food.
Well, and also, these are commuter students, and again, remember my father, ran a Greek diner. It's all about the food with me. This is how you build community. If we're breaking bread together, then it's not just, well, you're in and out, but you're actually sitting down, talking about your classes and a group project and that professor and how crazy Father Katsouros is. But you're getting a good meal.
Talk a little bit about your personal connection to Italy.
Oh, yeah, so Italy, of course, is, I think, one of the great tourist sites here in Chicago now. And one of the co-owners and operators is a very dear friend of mine. That's Lydia Bastianich. So Lydia has had a cooking show on PBS for many years. I was president of a high school in Manhattan for a long time, and her daughter is an alumna of that school. So I got to know Lydia there. And, you know, Lydia is very entrepreneurial, and so is working at Arrupe College. So early on here, you know, Lydia and I were sitting at Italy, you know, here in Chicago, and I said, all right, Lydia, you know what I'm going to ask you. I want you to join our board. So Lydia said, well, you know, I've sent my kids to Jesuit high schools. My daughter went to Georgetown. My son went to Boston College. So she said, I'm trying to discern like you Jesuits. So she said, so I prayed to when I pray, she said, I pray to the Blessed Mother. So she said, Blessed Mother, Father Katsouros is going to ask me to join his board. What should I do, Blessed Mother? And Lydia said, the Blessed Mother told me, you do whatever Father Katsouros asks you to do. So I thought, well, it's great when the Blessed Mother and I are on the same team.
That's good. It's good to have her on your sideline.
Yeah.
So you got a new class coming in September
Yeah.
or end of August. And how many kids are you taking? How many applied? And what's the change in terms of the applicant versus your first year?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, without many success metrics, I mean, we've just retained a class. Now we're graduating our first class, but the word is out. And, you know, if we ever doubted, if we were uncertain whether there was a need for this, well, you know, we have 200 seats for next year's class, max. We had 1,300 applicants.
Wow.
And some changes. We reached out to more African American applicants, which meant going to targeting more CPS institutions that reported higher enrollments of black students. So maybe our first year, we skewed a little bit more towards Catholic high schools, but this past year and now this year, we're seeing many more applicants from CPS as well as charter and Catholic schools. All of our students, pardon me, all of our applicants are required to interview with us. And we thought at first this would be, you know, an obstacle, that we were setting ourselves up for defeat here, like, oh, it's a hassle. Why should I do this? Why would I come in on a Saturday, you know, to be interviewed?
To do the interview. Yes.
You know, this could be a deterrent. But we find that our students find it, now this is my word, elevating. You know, they're being wooed. And, you know, we have our faculty, we have Jesuits, we have alumni and faculty around the university and staff of color doing the interviews. And we're looking for resilience and persistence in these students. So we'll ask a question, listen, can you describe an obstacle that you faced? And for some of our students, it's sort of like, which one do you want to hear about? Yeah.
Every day.
But we'll say, all right, so what was it? How did you deal with it? Did you ask anyone for help? Was that person helpful? Are you still in it? How was it resolved? What did you learn from it? How would you advise a younger sibling about it? And that really tells us a lot about a student's problem-solving skills. Again, we want these students to be wooed, so we have an Arrupe night for all the students that we accepted. And at the end of that, you know, and there's a student panel, and of course our current students are the best salespeople for this. But I present each student that we've accepted with a frame. And I say to them, you know, so here's a frame. They're all seniors in high school at that point. You can take a picture of yourself, you know, a selfie and stick it in the frame,
right,
or your prom picture, your graduation picture, a picture of me, whatever you want. I said, but hang on to this frame, because 2 years from now, in this frame, you're going to put your diploma from Arrupe College of Loyola University, and it's very moving for them. I mean,
right,
you know, I mean, a lot of our current sophomores are saying, I've got my frame, the diploma's going to go in there, you know, I remember what you said, Father. So it's very aspirational for them. But these are students that often are not wooed. They're not the full pays. They're not the 4 O's. They're not, you know, student athletes. But we want them to know that we really want them. And, you know, I think that they're influencing the trajectory of Jesuit higher ed. If we get this right here, you know, I can't wait to see this movement spread to other universities and colleges, Jesuit, Catholic, and, you know, the sky's the limit.
Well, this has been great, and I think everybody that watches will have learned something about what I said in the beginning, one of the most exciting education initiatives in the city of Chicago. I think you're doing special work and helping a group of kids that too often get left behind and have no chance to compete with other kids, and this is a great opportunity. And even if only 50 or 60 or 70% go on to four-year college, it's still such a big number of kids and such a big change. Thanks so much for coming.
Thanks a lot, Jim.
All right,
Thanks for your interest and enthusiasm.
Great.
Great.